make a start. I hope you've enjoyed the lunch and the conference so far. I'd like to welcome you all, to acknowledge actually the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people on whose lands we meet today and pay respects to their elders past and present. For this topic in particular, too, we have to acknowledge that Indigenous people in Australia were the first scientists and indeed the first people to understand deeply the biology and ecology of this environment and also the relations between land and the environment and sea and aquatic resources and the environment. As a way of introduction to this topic, I might just tell you about the ripples that have happened to get us to this point in our waters and in our seas. So this collaboration actually began in 2021 when we were kindly invited by the University of Melbourne to contribute some thoughts on environmental peace building. And I realized that many of my senior colleagues at the Solomon Islands National University at the time were actually working on issues related to environmental conflicts and peace building. And we had a really engaging discussion, and the really engaging discussion also led to the drafting of a joint paper, which has now been accepted for publication in Australian Pacific Viewpoint, and we're hoping it comes out soon. Thank you. And the paper itself kind of breaks down the concept of environmental peace building with particular attention to indigenous viewpoints. So we talk about this has not been a new concept in using management of the resources and our environmental resources for peace-building purposes and vice versa. We talk about this being actually an indigenous concept of some standing that was ruptured, particularly by colonialism and by the forces of the modern global economy. And so today we have a great bunch of people who are interested in these issues and engaged in these issues as researchers and also in their local places and communities. And I'll introduce them, I think, one by one. We're actually going to go in reverse order to the one on your program. So we're going to start with Dr. Lindsay Pendevarana. He's the head of geography at the Solomon Islands National University. And he's going to present to us today on how to embed natural resource development in place-based worldviews, and looking at the case of oil palm development in Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands, and the lessons it has for us more broadly. So please welcome Dr. Lindsay.
Thank you very much, moderator, and a very good afternoon to all of you. Before I go on, I would also like to pay my respect to the traditional owners of the land in which we meet, past, present, and emerging leaders, for providing us this space to discuss an issue that is important for our region, and that is on peace building, environmental peace building. Now, the issue of environmental peace building hinges on to, in the Solomons, natural resource sector, which is a very important sector in terms of the economy, right? When I say the natural resource sector, I'm referring to things like logging, mining, fisheries, and agriculture. And in our context, it contributes, if you read the recent central bank report or Reserve Bank report in the Solomons, it contributes roughly between 30 to 40% of our GDP, which is a significant contribution to our economy. But apart from the economic contribution of the natural resource sector, it does also support a lot of livelihood activities, livelihood services. It provides, many of the natural resource industries, for example, logging, mining, even the palm oil industry that I did a bit of research on, they also provide employment opportunities for a lot of our people. And in that way, it allows our people to diversify their livelihood needs by engaging in those natural resource sector. But having said that the natural resource sector is important in terms of the economy and in terms of development, it is also, if poorly managed, it also has the potential to trigger conflict and disorder in society. And we have seen this time and again in the Solomons and in other places as well, in the sub-region we'd call Melanesia, for example. We have seen, for example, disgruntled landowners or resource owners setting on fire equipment that belong to logging companies when they are disgruntled, as well as prospecting in, mining prospecting companies. So it is very, very critical. It's very important that we manage resources carefully. We know how to manage our resources in ways that will not, contribute to conflict and disorder in our society. And I will give you a classic example of the Guadalcanal Plains Palm Oil Limited to illustrate what I'm saying here. Now, I've done a bit of research work on the oil palm industry in the Solomons when I was doing my PhD here at the ANU. But then apart from that, when I went back to the Solomons, I also did a bit more work, research work on other natural resource-based activities that happen, particularly in the forestry sector and in the fisheries sector. But there are commonalities that can be drawn out. But in the context of the palm oil industry in the Solomons, we had a development approach that was very much influenced by the modernization logic. And that is, in order to develop, we need to modernize our customary land. We need to, register customary land and private in order to contribute to this modern caste economy. That, however, is demystified by the research that I'm doing. In the case of the Guadalcanal Plains, the smallholder outgrower scheme does not require the landowners, the customary landowners, to register the land. They keep the land in the customary domain, but still benefit from the monetary economy by selling their fresh fruit bunches to the mill. So that sort of gets us to rethink what's our development, what are we trying to do, what's the best development approach. So the reality is that our development is very much of a hybrid nature. It's not a monolithic, Eurocentric-driven kind of a development model, but it should be a model that encompasses our indigenous ways of thinking and our concept of what development should be for us. And when that is disembedded from our local place-based epistemologies and worldviews, you'll see conflicts arising. The Guadalcanal crisis, I am from Guadalcanal. I am from the weather coast of Guadalcanal. I contributed, this I have never said to anyone, but I contributed to the peace process. As a young graduate from USP, that when I returned home, the crisis emerged. And, it was a crisis around a lot of dissatisfaction over resources. But I contributed in a way that, at that time, everybody escaped the city, Honiara, and we were hiding out somewhere in Balasuna, for example. And our members of the Provincial Assembly, most of them were illiterate. And so we were called upon by the Premier of Guadalcanal at that time, late Ezekiel Alejua, to contribute writing the documents that they will use to negotiate peace here in Townsville. So I was one of those other two academics who risked our lives on the line, put our lives on the line to ensure that peace is returned on the island. But I have never mentioned this to anyone, but I'm saying it today. And so I lived through this experience. And so what I'm just going to say here is that for a country like the Solomon Islands, which is a country that has, in terms of land-based resources, 83% of land is within customary tenureship, right? To engage in any major project or activity that deals with land-based resources, it is wise and it is advisable that we must socially and culturally embed those development approaches on place-based worldviews, what we consider as development for us. That is what I wanted to say. And in the case of the Aqorau Plains Palm Oil Limited, when they came in, they reconfigured landowners' terms of engagement with the company. Unlike the previous oil pump company in the 1970s, where in terms of shareholding arrangements, the landowners only have 2% share in the company. Unlike now, the landowners are co-owners of the company. They have 20% equity share in the company. That is on top of other benefits that they receive through dividends, through royalties, through the smallholder outgrower scheme, which allows customary landowners to cultivate oil palm on their customary land, and then they sell to the company without altering the nature of the customary land. That the landowners see as something that respects their way of life, and their culture and their traditions. And so, before I close, I just want to make the statement that for a country like the Solomon Islands, moving forward in terms of development projects that are natural resource-based must be such that they must capture the worldviews, the development thinking of the host communities, which are local communities in the country. I think with that, I'll stop there and I'll take questions and comments later on. Thank you very much for listening.
Excellent talk story and opening this morning, Dr. Lindsay. So I will take all the presentations first and save your questions for the end. So I'd like to invite Ruth Maitala to come and talk to us next. Ruth Maitala is the founder and director of Dignity Pacific, which is an excellent research and also practice in Solomons that does a lot of the research to inform gender and social inclusion. She also has a rich background and history in being involved in women and peace work, and was one of the members of a group called Women for Peace, which, again, like Dr. Lindsay and others, pushed for peace at the end of the civil conflict in Solomons, and for those of you who don't know, that finished in 2003. So I would like to invite Ruth Maitala to come and talk to us, and she's going to talk about gender perceptions on climate-induced conflicts and peace building in Solomon Islands. Please welcome Ruth.
Good afternoon. I am Ruth Maitala from Solomon Islands. I come from the tribal group of Aqorau in East Malaita. And I just want to say thank you to the traditional owners of this land to allow us to have the meeting here and also to exchange our knowledge and wisdom in this space. It is a privilege for me to be among some of the world's distinguished scholars here at ANU. And at this juncture, I would like to say thank you to Anouk for arranging my attendance to this conference and also to my sponsors. So I have two objectives to what I want to talk about today. And one is to share the gender perspectives on climate-induced conflicts and provide some opportunities for peace building in Solomon Islands. And the second one is to highlight some of the community voices that I've heard throughout my work in the communities in Solomon Islands. In October 2000, the United Nations Security Council adopted a resolution that for the first time recognized the unique and disproportionate impacts of violent conflict on women and girls. UN Security Council Resolution 1325 acknowledged the importance of women's participation in conflict prevention, resolution, and peace-building processes, and the historical undervaluing of women's contribution. So Solomon Islands, the Solomon Islands government has a women, peace and security strategy that is developed in 2017 and has been expired in 2021. However, with some good intentions, I believe that the strategy has overlooked gender considerations in climate crisis and increasing stress at the community levels. The work on including gender and peace building and development discourse in the Solomon Islands is quite young. Having said that, I draw from the gender and peace building understanding as an exploration of how gender and peace building can interface conceptually and practically. So in my presentation, I want to focus on economic conflict, social conflicts, and environmental conflicts. I won't go deep into these topics, but I would just like to focus on the household level budgets. So many Solomon Islanders live on customary land, as our previous speakers said. Increasingly, we experience land disputes and conflicts due to impacts of climate change. The ongoing challenge of king tides has brought about fears and stress related on land availability and access to land areas for food gardens. I would like to highlight one case that I'm working with at the moment. For the Gongongosila Island people in East Malaita, king tides has pressured many of the island dwellers to explore ways to move out of the island. There are no food gardens on the island except for a few vegetable beds, which is not sufficient to feed the family on a bad weather day. In Tuo, in Reef Islands, in Eastern Solomons, impacts of climate change on the environment and land community and gender relationships has impacted on land tenure seriously. So in Tuo, where I did some work in about 3 years ago, due to climate change, because these are small villages and these are villages that are established on land that is individually owned by different clans or different families. And once the land is growing smaller and smaller, people are also fighting over how much of the land can they use for gardens and how much of the land can be used for building houses. Sea level rise forces people to move inland, and this has increasingly impacted on land governance and the traditional tenure system. In Malaita, where tenure is patrilineal, many women find themselves powerless and excluded from decision-making processes. Women with no land rights are silenced, and their dependency on the male line increasingly causes much trauma. So trauma is not only caused by the impact of climate change on land and families. Women mainly are traumatized by destroyed houses during disasters and destruction of their personal kitchen utensils and things like that, which is, for some, might not be significantly important, but for most of the women in the villages, these are things that help them in their livelihoods. The second area is the social conflicts, which impact on traditional roles of men and women, as well as increases in family violence. So I want to highlight some of the perceptions that I've learned from the communities that I worked in. One young wife argued, I traveled to look for food and I sent my 2 children to Honiara, this is the capital city, so they can go to school. My husband doesn't go to the sea, so instead I paddle out to the other island and sleep there for 3 nights to collect seafood for eating and for sale, for income generation. I have 4 children and sometimes I think the relatives in Honiara are not supporting my children to attend school. I heard from someone talks or some families that my children are not going to school, but when relatives come home for a holiday to the village, I always look after them. So this is one woman that she's a young wife and she's less than 40 years old, but she goes out to another island to collect food for family and also for income generation. So there's a lot of failed expectations around family relationships and connection to families who are living in town. And the last area that I want to talk to is on the environmental conflict. Here's another quote from an elderly woman. She said, sometimes I paddle to the mainland to collect coconuts, only to find bunches of coconuts on the coast. Another clan member has already collected the coconuts before me. The coconut belonged to my father, and the other person is my nephew. We always contest for who gets to the plantation first. And if he gets there early, he collects the coconuts, and I would spend the whole day paddling to and from the plantation, which is on the mainland. So growing clan populations put pressure on land tenure and land use. Access rights to food gardens are contested by different family members and how they relate to each other and to the plantation owner. Access and control over plantations are often dominated by male family members more than women in Malaita. Economic pressures on family also contribute to increase in family violence, further instigating trauma. Just want to give an example of a research that we are currently doing with Griffith University in the Western Province. Our recent finding is that school fees are so high that parents are looking for ways to earn an income in the village. And sometimes even natural resources are not enough to make that income happen to support school fees. And school fees are one of the biggest expenses in a family. So as you can see, there's the impact on land. And there's also impact on the environment. That takes away from land that people who are living on smaller islands can access for gardening. So who should resolve the conflict? I believe we are all responsible to resolve the conflict. So in the Solomons, we have churches, tribes, clans, non-government organizations, donors and funders, and the government. There's some opportunities for peace building. Church perceived by both men and women as conflict resolution structure for many Solomon Islanders. The message of forgiveness is greatly practiced by Solomon Islanders. In my experience, forgiveness without proper counseling does not achieve healing. Aside from custom and culture, the church forms a strong foundation for peace-building conversations. It allows people to speak freely in the spirit of forgiveness. And peacefulness. Opportunities for peace building include capacity building for pastors and church leaders who live and work in the churches. Church can link with government ministries responsible for environment and climate change to create emergency plans and encourage drills for the children. There's also an opportunity that exists in the Solomon Islands for environment and peace education. I was glad that Dr. Chancellor was talking about the living labs. I think that's a positive way forward for Solomon Islands, especially to immerse younger scholars into the real life experience. So addressing the environmental needs of women and men should be considered differently because climate change and conflicts affects women and men differently. So there's a lot of opportunities for peace building and also creating spaces so that we can all talk together, talanua, talk story between government, civil societies, landowners, resource owners, as well as women and youth. Here are some of the ways that I think we can use to go forward. Collaborate with regional organizations such as South Pacific communities for resource mobilization, because one of the experiences that I have working in the peace work is always the issue of funding. So sometimes there are good intentions and good work that we want to do with the communities, but we lack the funding to move the work. We can also connect with tribes and land councils and resource owners, especially to work out mechanisms that we can process or we can continue the conversation of peace. And we can also invest in partnerships and collaborative work. One man cannot do anything unless we work together to do something. And so there are some work that we have done previously, working with different partners and different stakeholders to make sure that we achieve greater than what we can do by ourselves. So just in conclusion, climate conflicts, climate-induced conflicts affect men and women differently. So the man might not be worried about the house falling down, but the woman, or the man might be worried about the house, but the woman will be worried about the kitchen utensils. So due to church influence, the message of forgiveness is very effective, but forgiveness alone cannot heal our land and our people. And I think the last comment that I want to make here is that I was involved in returning of 489 guns from Malaita, just right after the ethnic tension. And as my previous colleague has mentioned, it's such a risky job. I was a mother and grandmother, but I have to risk going out to the communities and consulting with the militants so that they can surrender their guns. And this is for the good of the country. So it's not only for, so peace building can work if we are willing to work together. Thank you.
Thank you. So as you can see from our first two presenters already, this is a group of researchers that are also heavily embedded in practice and the experience of conflict in their communities. Now, I forgot to mention in the sort of introduction with our ripples that led us here that we also had a workshop earlier this week just for people who are involved in this space, both practice and research around peace building in the Pacific. And this was partly funded too by Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, which is CAS. It's a German group that particularly has an interest in democracy and human rights. So we're grateful for that funding to have our small workshop. If I can just tell you a funny story about that workshop before I introduce Dr. Henry, we had this small funding, small get-together of 10 to 15 people, and at the same time, in the same venue, there was a very largely funded exercise, and it was held by some security colleagues in the university, and they were doing sort of simulations of conflicts, and what would you do if you were in this simulation of conflict? And I couldn't help reflect that in the way that we've been working, with ripples and ripples and ripples of change, it's very different from the big splashes, the big interventions, and how we also, as a university, need to reflect on, are we training people for intervention or for partnership with peace building? This is a big issue. So it's just ironic to sort of be side by side with the larger interventions in the security space and our very small peace building space. But I think you can see already the value of these discussions. Now we're going to change context now. So we're going to hear from Dr. Henry Ivarachur. He's the Deputy Director of the Pacific Security College here at ANU, and he's going to talk to us today about, his title is named Spreading the Love from Environmental Extraction, and he's going to talk specifically about the North Fly Rubber Project. Please welcome Dr. Henry.
Just want to time myself so I finish in time. Like my colleagues, I'd also like to acknowledge our Papa line below ground where you may sit down and talk, or line number line and another one line below Canberra. I'm Henry Ibarature. I'm from Papua New Guinea. My talk is not actually research. I actually worked as a program manager for a company called PNG, Sustainable Development Program. And this company, at one point in time, was the major shareholder of OTML, Octary Mine Limited, in PNG. So my job description was already set there. I needed all I was told to do was, this is your work, go deliver it. So when Anouk said to me, spreading the love, I was trying to think of a better way of explaining STEAM, but what came to my head at the point in time was spreading the love, and that's the picture I have of spreading the love. I'll discuss what I mean. If we can move to the next slide, then you can, I can do that. So this should give you a context on where I was working from. So you're looking at this map. You see Kiunga right up there in the Indonesian border. That's where Octary Mine is located. So in around 1960s, Kennecott Copper Corporation discovered copper and gold in Western Province in that part of but they withdrew in 1975, and along came BHP, who was the major shareholder. So they had roughly around 52% share of the mine. And Octary Mine was created around 1981, and they started extracting copper concentrate, copper from there, and shipping it down to world markets. The other partners in the mine were AMCO, PNG government, and Inmet Mining. In 2002, BHP left the mining operations because their global reputation was greatly tarnished by the destruction that the mine operations was doing to the environment. So if you look at that mine, where from Kiunga, the copper concentrate came down by barge to the mouth of the fly, where it was put into a silo vessel, and export vessels came to the silo vessel, extracted the copper concentrate, and to the markets. In bad weather season, that silo vessel will be parked in Fairfax Harbor outside Port Moresby. So the barges will travel all the way to Port Moresby, where they'll offload the copper concentrate onto the silo vessel, and export vessels will come, collect it, and take it to the market. I mean, I've been through the whole process, and when you go onto this silo vessel, as they extract the ore, you can see how much they're extracting, and you can calculate right away how much money was being generated by the company. It was very easy to calculate. Anyway, when I came to work for, what's the name? PNG Sustainable Development Program, that was around 2002, before I went to work for the Forum Secretariat. But before I left, I could see the signs that one day this company will be taken over by the government. They used a word called its shares were canceled, when in fact its shares were nationalized, meaning the government took control of the mine. Now, and I have actually witnessed the destruction of the environment, but I wasn't involved. I was there to try and, when I say share the wealth, is helping people outside the mine corridor to benefit from the mine's revenues and shares. So when they say, I don't know whether you understand mining operations. But when mines operate, the people who benefit from the mines operations, compensation, etc., are people that are within the corridor of the mines activities. So from Kiunga, where in the Star Mountains, where the mine is situated, they actually transfer the copper concentrate in slurry, in pipes, in liquid form. It travels all the way down to a shed in Kiunga where it's dried up into hard powder form. Then it's loaded onto barges and taken to the silo vessel, which then where export vessels come and collect it and go abroad with it. And when it comes down, there's all kinds of impacts there. Now, unfortunately for Oktedi, they tried to build a tailings dam back in 2012, or earlier in the mine's mine life, but the tailings dam collapsed because the geography around Oktedi is very unstable. So what they did was, instead of the tailings being contained in a tailings dam, they just dumped everything into the river system. So what was once a very pristine creek is now a huge slurry of mud that comes down all the way down to Kiunga, goes all the way down to the Fly River. So the Fly River is a very long river. It's about 1,000 kilometers long. And so when it comes down, it causes sludge, suffocation of forestry, food, sago, the staple that people from that part of the world eat, and destruction of the marine life, particularly barramundi. And it doesn't stop. So along that way, it comes all the way down to Daru, which is the capital of Western Province. And sometimes I think it might have come down to certain parts of the Torres Strait as well. And so they left, and then they gave their shares to this company, PNG Sustainable Development Program. And our job was to make sure that the mine, when the mine closed in, at the time it was some date that they said, they've now extended the date to 2035. So the mine continues. And our job was to make sure that when the mine came to a close, that Western Province would have major projects like, socioeconomic projects that would replicate the kind of wealth that the mine was generating, so that the country doesn't really suffer impact by the absence of revenue from the mine. So that was what we were supposed to do. Anyway, when the government took over Oktedi mine, it has now legislated or repealed laws that allow people to sue BHP or the mine over environmental damages. So they have literally forfeited their right to take the mine to court. That's the part of the agreement that they have. So they can't complain about the destruction, environmental destruction that's happening there. That's, all these villages along there, some like it's 150 villages. So my job was to get those kind of projects underway, but mainly for those communities outside of the mine impact area. So the work that I did that I was going to talk about is a community called the Lake Murray Rubber Project. Lake Murray is just slightly outside of but it's the biggest lake in PNG where I did what they call hybrid rubber project. So we went into contact with a company called Northfly Rubber Limited, which is based in Kiunga. It also had a rubber processing plant. So we went into a arrangement with local landowners who would use their land to plant hybrid rubber, which they will harvest over time. Once when it matures and they harvest the kaplan, they sell a kaplan to not-fly rubber, and they get cash. The kaplan goes to Kiunga, it's processed, and it's shipped by Octedi's export vessels to the market. So it was an arrangement that was convenient for landowners. They own the land, they own the timber, rubber trees, they tapped it whenever they wanted to tap. Now, how did we come to suggesting working on hybrid rubber? Well, the history of Western Province people, they have always been planting rubber trees. So we thought it's much better to deal with an economic activity that they had already been exposed to. Instead of the old trees, we will supply them with hybrid rubber so that the production is high and the income to the communities is high. And so 800 communities in Lake Murray, or 800 households in Lake Murray decided to participate in this project. And I had to do an agreement between the company, Not-Fly Rubber, to deliver this project. The community was not involved in the actual arrangement, but what I did was have a provision in the agreement that the landowners participating in this project have a provision for grievance. If they had problems with the project, they can then bring it to us and we try and adjudicate how we can help them. But otherwise, they really had no real role in it, but benefit from this thing. Well, anyway, when we signed the agreement, with the whole board of PNG STP got down to Western Province. We had a big party, signed the agreement, and 2 weeks later, the agreement was torn apart because there was an agreement that landowners really wanted no interest in the loans that they were going to take for this small project. And the loan interest rate was 2%. And so they tore the thing up, and I need to go back and renegotiate the whole agreement. And I brought with me a bank teller from PNG Banking Corporation, the Kundu Bank, because they wouldn't trust me as a person. Like trying to explain the 2%, even though I have a PhD, my knowledge is not compared to what they expect from me. So I brought a person from the bank, told him to wear his bank uniform. We came, and then we traveled the whole of the island, Lake Murray area, where he got a whiteboard, put it up, and showed them what 2% interest meant, what 2% meant from $300, $1,000, etc. So they were very clear. Now, women were not involved in this thing, in the conversation, but I could see very clearly that women will be the big partners in this thing. And so I started telling them, you have to bring the women into this conversation. They will be the ones who will be taking this thing forward. Anyway, that was how we restructured it, but because we already lost, the arrangement was already kind of like messed up. So we had to restructure it and to keep the company out of the equation. So we went into arrangement with Octedi's community mines, community projects to take over the partnership. So we paid the Octedi mine to manage the contract, keeping us away from the exchange of the conflict and troubles. I left the company in 2006 to go and work at the Pacific Islands Forum, so I don't know what happened. But this conversation has really ignited my interest to revisit this work and write it as a research project where it's not an environmental conflict problem that I came into. It's a problem that already existed, and I was trying to share that's why I say sharing the love from one group that were affected or had whose resources and environment were used and whose environment was destroyed by mining, and try to distribute it to others in the mine area. The company was arranged in such a way that there's a ratio in which benefits were distributed between Western Province and Papua New Guinea. And so my big lesson there was when there's big money, politicians' hands get very itchy. So there's around, I think, $2 billion US in revenue that sits with this company. It was registered in Singapore deliberately as such to prevent politicians having their hands on it. But in the end, the politicians have won, and the fight is continuing with some members of government to have access to the money that's sitting elsewhere in Singapore. But otherwise, this was a model, the first of its kind, which have allowed royalties from mining that were continued in perpetuity because of the way it was arranged. That's all I can share. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you. Now, Professor from Aqorau would be well known to everyone who's been at the conference thus far, so I'm not going to give him a lengthy introduction. I am going to say, of course, just in case anyone's sort of new today, he is the Vice Chancellor of the Solomon Islands National University, and he is a great intellectual inspiration, not just in the Solomon Islands, but regionally, and has worked in innovative environmental and fisheries programs in the region and also nationally. So we look to him today to provide some remarks on the theme that we have of environmental conflict and peace building. Please welcome Professor.
Thank you, Anouk, and good afternoon, everyone. I don't have a prepared presentation, but I just wanted to talk to you about my experience and maybe share that journey with you. So I come from the family, about land. I've had experience with conflict over land. I want to share a bit of my experience in addressing some of the fisheries conflicts that we've had, but also like to make some commentary on some of the challenges that we're facing on forestry and also mining. And largely, my focus is I want to be able to talk about not the problems that we've heard about, but really about the opportunities and how we can address some of the problems that we're facing. Because I do believe that there's one issue a real challenge and the real opportunity is that we have not actually addressed the right development trajectory, the right development model. And I do feel that many of these conflicts arise because we have actually alienated our indigenous people, our people from development, from whether it's in logging, whether it's in mining, and for a long time in fisheries where we've been largely relatively known as bystanders, while others outside the region and others outside our countries have actually come in and benefited from our natural resources. And that's the reason why we have all these conflicts. And if you come to Honiara today, when you get off the plane and you take a drive down from Henderson Airport right down to the end of town, to White River, you'll be surprised at the number of buildings that you find there, largely owned by non-Solomon Islanders. And this is part of the problem that I'm finding in the conversation that we're having in the region is that most of our conversation, just before lunch, we heard from Amelia and Tonga how most of the licenses in that whale watching industry they have at Vavau is actually held by expatriates. And so this is the problem that I'm finding and facing in the conversation that we're having, in that many of our governments, in our effort and desperation to develop, we have done so by forgetting and neglecting those of us who actually own 80% of the natural resources, and that's the reason why we've got conflict. And it's the same thing I said when I observed the evolution of the Guadalcanal crisis as I was there. My impression of that was it was basically, as Lindsay said, a cry out from the people who found themselves secluded and crowded out from their own land by those who came in from outside and invested, basically being bystanders in the exploitation and also in the benefits of their own natural resources. So the solution to many of our problems that we're finding now is that we need to rethink the way in which we develop our resources. And so I come back once again to the experience I had. My first journey in the tuna fisheries was that, yes, many of our countries had declared exclusive economic zones. We were not, in theory, benefiting as the primary right holders of the resources. But in reality, all of that benefits were actually going out, and I used to describe it as being, we were exercising our sovereign rights on behalf of fishing nations who were the primary beneficiary of the rate of return, the extractive value of our tuna resource, until we went and set up the Vessel Day Scheme in 2010. And Lisa, you will know how Tokelau, who joined the PNA joined us. And in 2012, we welcomed Tokelau into the fold in Alotau. And I remember, Anouk, were you there? Yeah. We did so, there were tears because we were welcoming Tokelau. But the result of that effort saw Tokelau's economic benefit from their resources increase from 600,000 a year to almost $10 to $11 million, which actually told us something. What it told us was that it told us how much we were actually losing and the opportunities that we actually lost. So I always, and I'm a true believer in, it's the design, when it comes to our natural resources, it's the design of the way in which we manage, plus also the business model, that then yields the economic returns that we have. But most importantly, for us in the Pacific, it's making sure that we put our own people at the forefront of our development trajectory. And in 2010, when we were in Palau, we had a delegation from the World Bank who came and accused a group of us of damaging the unity of the Pacific Islands when we went and set up the parties to the Nauru Agreement in the Marshall Islands. They said you were destroying the Foreign Fisheries Agency. And my good friend Glenn Joseph from the Marshall Islands said to the World Bank delegation, all we're trying to do is to ensure that we get, as resource owners, the largest and biggest share of the benefits from our tuna resource. Now tell us, what's wrong with that? Is there a problem with that? And that's the problem that I'm finding in the conversation and with our governments. And of course, you and I, we're not able to give our ministers anything underneath the table to influence policy outcomes. But we can influence through our votes, we can influence through the shareholding arrangements that we've done, and you've successfully been able to do that with our logging companies. Now, the same problem also applies in the logging industry in Melanesia, where the resource owners are largely bystanders in the exploitation of their own resource. Now you just put yourself in their picture. Just imagine yourself, this is your house, your home, you own trees around your houses. Now in order for someone to come in, so you all of a sudden, you find yourself in a position where a logging company comes into your backyard and they say, we now have the timber rights because someone else has allocated those timber rights to this Malaysian company. We have the rights to now come in and cut down the trees in your backyard. And the way in which the model is designed is such that it's designed to benefit the Malaysian company. It's the same in PNG. So this is And I often believe that, you don't have to have a degree in economics to be able to work out who gets the key benefits of this. Now, in the case of Solomon Islands, and just put yourself in the position of a landowner in Solomon Islands, in your backyard, this Malaysian company comes in, and that tree that is in your backyard, you own the land, you own the tree, but you as the owner, you're only going to be entitled to about 15% of the value of that tree. The government gets 25%, and then the Malaysian logging company gets 60% of the value of the tree. Now, that is how our government has actually designed the legislation. So I often say, we are accessories to a crime against our own people. And that's why I wonder, what kind of economics are we teaching our people who graduate from here, from USP, from SINU, going back and then looking at how we allow our own people with our own natural resources to be exploited. And so we need to be seriously thinking about the kind of economic theory and development that we have, what we want. And it's getting worse. Now, if you want to expect, how can we expect the quality of lives of our people to be improved when the only thing that we have, which is land and our natural resources, is utilized for the benefit of others? I come back to those of you who have been to Honiara, and if you go down to Honiara. Now, from the airport to the end of the town, and I say this with due respect, greatest respect, that all of that development there, most of it, and I think I can count with maybe just one hand or two hands, I'm not really sure, the number of buildings that are actually owned by Solomon Islanders, indigenous Solomon. All of that land is owned by outsiders. All of those buildings are owned by outsiders. And this, we have allowed this to happen. So we are largely in Honiara bystanders in the development of our own country. And I really do feel, for me, it is a painful thing when I come to talk about it, because in 2021, just before we had this, I think a week before the riots, I predicted that we would actually have the next tension would arise, because I could see that there were bubbling hotspots emerging because of the increasing alienation of our people. And sure enough, a week later, we had the burnings in Chinatown. And it exemplifies for me our inability to be able to think about development that actually puts our own people's interest ahead of others. Now, during the tension in Guadalcanal, I was there. I lived through the whole episode, the whole encounter. And my perception was quite simple, that it was all about land. It was about land allocation and beneficiary of resources. Now, I have not actually seen government development putting the interest of our own people and resource owners at the heart of our development. And so it's a sad tragedy. If there's anything that we have learned from, this terrible, economically disastrous tension that we had in Solomon Islands, is that we haven't actually learned anything. And standing here, Australia actually invested billions of dollars in helping to restore law and order, but yet the primary underlying root cause of the fact that we are largely still aliens in the development of our own resources is still there. And it's now getting worse, because that's the same thing that you're now seeing with logging. You're now seeing it in the mining company. So it's not, for me, rocket science to address these issues. It's quite simple. The real challenge and the real problem is that most of us don't have the political connections. The political economy is such that it's the extractive industry that controls the country, and it controls the political process. And I often say to the Australians who try and understand the influence that others have, you're not going to be able to influence, because it's the logging, it's the Malaysian, and I say that with great respect. It's the loggers and the miners who have access to our politicians, who are then able to control what's going on. And that is why it's been difficult in the last 40 years to get any real reforms to the logging industry. And it's been difficult to get any real reforms to the forestry legislation, because they control the influence that they have is such, it's disproportionate to people like ourselves. I come from landowning group, and our traditional lands have been logged, not once, but quite a few times, and yet you just don't see the benefits of it at all. So the country is crying out, the region is crying out for innovation and thinking, and I often, as I reflect on it, it's not real rocket science. It's common sense. And anyone that you want to develop the resources, make sure that our people are the primary beneficiaries of the benefits from our resources. And I'm happy that we were able to do that through the Vessel Day scheme and the PNA. And I know Tokelau I met the Faipule one time, and they were so pleased with the outcome. But that's because the governance arrangements for tuna is slightly different from land-based resources in that it's shared. There's secondary and third layer governance layers that actually protect. Whereas when it comes to pure natural resources such as forestry, such as petstime, such as our land, our own people, our own leaders actually commit, for me, a crime against our own people. And that's where I think, I've had this conversation with the Australian government officials, because they invest a lot of money into the development of the country. And I say to them, but you're also contributing by failing to hold the government to account in this respect. Thank you very much.
Your name and address your questions. Judy?
1 second, Judy. Hi, my name's Judy Powder. I'm from the Department of Pacific Affairs. I have 2 questions. The first one is directed at Ruth. When you talked about the different kinds of conflict, I was thinking that there are many other factors that are contributing to that conflict, not just what's happening, I guess, in terms of climate-induced disaster and environmental change. And I just wondered how important it was in the work that you do that it is framed in terms of an the climate change-induced cause of the conflict, rather than talking about many of the other factors that might be causing the conflict. And the second part to that question is, when you talk about peace building, do you centre a lot of your work on the process and talk about the environment in that context, as against or with talking about what you're actually going to do to address the climate-induced crisis? Sorry, climate change. I was tired, it's the afternoon, but you know what I mean. Thank you. And the second question was to transform. I've had the benefit of seeing what's happened in a desert area of Australia over the last 40 years, where increasingly the local indigenous people have greater access to the wealth that is generated by a mine. And a lot of conflict has occurred over time. So there's increased access, but the distribution of the wealth that comes from that development is uneven. We're talking about humans. So there's an uneven distribution of the wealth. So what you were saying seemed to make an enormous amount of sense, not disagreeing with it at all. It's a fantastic vision, but I do have that concern about how the benefits of economic development are distributed as equitably as possible, but also that are you at the risk of people being co-opted into environmental damage as a result of them getting more benefits from the mine, the forestry, whatever it may be.
Thank you for the question. I think I'll try and answer the first part. So how I selected the areas that I talked about in my presentation was just for the purpose of this panel. But in terms of my work, I have been involved over the last maybe 20 or so years looking at ways to address the causes of conflict in the Solomons. I have played different roles in working during the conflict and also during the recent burnings in Chinatown. And I think it is difficult to put all those different impacts of, say, armed conflict or the conflicts caused by climate change in one session. So that's how I want to respond to your question. And then the second part of that question, while I was talking up there, I was also thinking about how we exist and how we coexist in our communities in the Solomons. Like, you cannot take a woman out of her community and say that she can be singled out from that community. You can look at her as part of the community. And so when you address peace building, efforts to work on peace building, we can work with the community and get the advice and the counsel from the community structures that can help us to work with them on peace building, and we can also work on the processes. For example, I have been supporting the Ministry of Traditional Governance and Peace and Economical Affairs to look at the Traditional Governance Bill and to look at how the traditional governance structure can also be used as a mechanism for peace building and supporting, the continuous work that the government is doing on the peace process. And then on the other side, recently I have been working with some communities in Guadalcanal. These are the youths that have had some differences between them, but have requested us to go and sit down and work with them on open counseling. So there are pockets of activities that are going on, but I think in terms of coordination, the government is doing that overall coordination for peace building and the peace process. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I think you're right. The current distribution of royalties, if left to their own devices, can actually create a lot of inequity and create a lot of disputes. So I wrote a paper on this in 2004, I think. I think it was published, what was that old publication that they used to have here at ANU many years ago. But the argument that I made was that there has to be some public policy intervention in the way in which royalties and benefits can be, the reason being that without any public policy intervention from government in the design of the way in which royalties are then distributed amongst the communities, inevitably to result in disputes. And therefore the interest of the public or the government is to try and avoid disputes. So you're right in that there is, on the one hand, it's difficult to intervene because these are largely private property rights. So without an attempt to try and shape it and reshape it, you're going to inevitably find that you perpetuate the problem, which is what I'm seeing in terms of the logging, distribution of logs, the mining benefits. Just last week on the weekend, my family is involved in distribution of water beneficiary rights that supply the tuna cannery industry. And so I'm seeing greed by individuals. So yeah, I do agree with what you said.
Yeah. Further questions? Yes, in the middle. Well, the microphone's coming behind you.
Good afternoon. My name is Liha Pasuvanakamma. I'm from Aqorau. And, thank you. I know Dr. Chen's from Aqorau, and I have great respect for him, especially his work in the Pacific. And I was listening, and I selected this topic because I was thinking, I really want to learn. And then I'm listening, and I'm getting frustrated with passion and love for our people. And I'm thinking, why are we discussing this here? And I'm really interested to know what is NAU going to do about it, because I'm thinking, I love the solutions for moving forward for our people. And you're very right. The wisdom, the wealth, the knowledge are with our people. I feel that. I feel the pain. But also our people need a lot of education, teaching and about all this, because I'm thinking in terms of the peace building solution moving forward, you are the expert of our people in the Solomons. You have the knowledge, the wisdom, the values. In terms of a cultural framework, is that something that we need to look at? That you go back to those values, go back to rebuild a cultural framework. And I look at all the different stakeholders, the church, our communities, our leaders, because the government, and that's why I say education is so important, because we need to get the right people to the government to care for our people. But then we're not going to, it's been years and years, and I love the success stories about the Vessel Day scheme, because I was part of that, coming from a small island to Aqorau, and you made that. There was a solution, but I love to see how you, as expert from Solomon, with the help of ANU or the government, that you develop the solutions based on your cultural framework for your people, because they are the owners. They are they own the resources, the wisdom, the knowledge. We need to really acknowledge that. Sorry with my passion. I just want to say that because I love what you're doing, and all of you, for our people. But I think we need to really be louder, that we go back to those, rebuild our cultural framework as a solution. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that comment. Dr. Henry, did you want to respond to that, or Dr. Transform? Okay, yeah, we'll take it as a comment. Any other questions? And let's have a discussion about that too. That's a big question, and one we can have more ripples and more discussions about. Thank you, Miranda.
Hello, thank you. My name's Miranda Forsyth. I'm here at the ANU. Thank you very much to the panellists. And Ruth, when you were talking about losing your kitchen implements, that struck my heart. I was thinking that would in fact be terrible. But my question really is about the role of youth in Solomon Islands and environmental, I suppose, campaigning and peacemaking and advocacy more broadly. So when I was doing some field work in Fiji, it seemed that the youth groups, particularly urban youth groups, were actually developing really productive relationships with their families in the islands and helping them to campaign and to draw attention to the kind of political economy issues that Dr. Transform spoke about. And I'm wondering, is there a role that youth is playing in Solomon Islands? And if not, is there a way that that they can in fact be empowered to do that? Thank you.
Thanks, Miranda, for that question. So I'll answer that question wearing another hat that I wear. I'm a member of the executive committee of the National Youth Council. And I was just, as we were speaking now, reading an email from our Secretary General who have said that unfortunately, because of the financial crisis that the government is facing now, that they now have to move up from the current building that we rent and move up to the top floor so that we reduce the rental and the cost to the National Youth Council, because the government is not able to pay for the rental, the total rental, which from that hat that I wear, every time I use the opportunity to say how disappointed I am by my perception, and this is just a perception I have from my experience as a member of the Executive Committee of the National Youth Congress, by the lack of support that I see for our youth. It's serious. The government and largely what we say about youth development in the country is, from my perspective as a member of the National Executive Committee, it's lip service. I don't see it at all. 70% of the population of Solomon Islands is under 30. And we've only got two programs, in fact only one program that supports the National Youth Council, apart from funding that the National Youth Council, and this is the National Youth Council of Solomon Islands, that it gets through the Ministry of Youth and Women, that pays for the salaries and the rental. But there's only one project that we're involved in, that's with PLAN, and that's on climate change, that supports one or two offices in the provinces. Apart from that, there's almost, from my perspective, no support at all for our youth. And yet here is one of the most powerful instruments and grouping of people who can actually influence and have a big role to play in our. There's pockets of support that they might get from maybe World Vision, or they might get from Save the Children through the Honiara City Council Youth. There's this New Zealand funded youth hub. But by and large, every suburb in Honiara, youth just congregate, and there's almost no activities for them. And so they're just drawn into selling bitunat, getting involved in drugs, getting involved in alcohol. And Delvin sitting behind you will be able to attest to the fact that there's disturbances all the time in some of the suburbs in Honiara. And so I've raised this with the High Commissions and with everyone who comes to see us at the university. I take off my senior Vice Chancellor's hat and I put on my Executive Committee hat as a National Youth Council and express my disappointment by the lack of support that I see. Yesterday we had a presentation on youth and in the region. And I think there is what goes on at a certain level, but the reality on the ground which we deal with as a member of the National Youth Council is different from the conversation that I heard yesterday on the National Youth. And we have a member of the Executive Committee who's represented in the National Pacific Youth Congress. But at the grassroots level, it's disappointing, really disappointing. And I'm disappointed because I just got that email now as we sat down on the fact that our funding has been cut. So we talk about security challenges and all of that. We're sitting. The youth all the riots that we've had in Honiara are all done by the youth. So I'm hopeful that we can actually do something, but at this point in time, we just have to support the National Youth Council as best as we can.
Any other last questions? Yes, we've got at the gentleman at the back and Amanda. Yes. Sorry, I can't see. I've got my glasses. Yeah.
Thank you, and sorry for coming late a bit. 2 weeks ago, I met a very inspirational Solomon Island youth, Cynthia Haunihi. Hopefully, I've said the surname right. Cynthia is a force to be reckoned with. We were sitting up at an international conference, and I was privileged to sit at the panel with her. She, from Solomon Islands, she was the one that led, or one of the leading members of the 27 youths from the USP law students that eventually put up the ICJ case, International Court of Justice case. Vanuatu took it on. They went to the Vanuatu government, and Vanuatu sided with those youths. And Cynthia, to me, Dr. Transform sort of really symbolizes what you say about youths in Solomon Islands having the capacity, if we resource them correctly, youth in the Pacific having the capacity to go beyond the boundaries that we are somehow cornered to. Our youths are very driven, very purposed, and seeing our challenges, they can challenge existing system, they can create change. And Cynthia, to me, inspired us all. As a law student, who would have thought that some law student in a university that is not Harvard, not ANU, out there in the Pacific, would take one of the largest case of humanity's history at the highest court of this land, of this world. Those students are very inspirational to the entire planet. And to see that someone like Cynthia from Solomon Islands and other Pacific students are leading this is a very inspirational story and a testament of the power of youths across the Pacific. That's just my comment, just to enhance your, words around the potential for our youths. Thanks.
Thank you. Last question. I think we have time for one or two more. Yes, maybe last question. Thank you.
From Australian National University. Question for Dr. Lindsay Pendevarana. You mentioned that the oil palm arrangements were renegotiated so as to be more beneficial for the landholders. I'm sure that many landholders or people supporting them would love to know how that was renegotiated. So I just wondered if you could tell us how that came about. Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. When I mentioned a renegotiation and a reconfiguration of the shareholding arrangement, unlike in the previous arrangement where you have the landowners have 2% share, in the current arrangement now the landowners have 20% share in the company. Apart from that, they have other schemes, like they set up what is known as the Aqorau Plains Resource Development Association and a business arm, the Aqorau Plains Company Resource Limited, that invests in other economic activities in Honiara. They had a depot refueling station in main town Honiara City. They had rest houses and other development activities also within the Aqorau Plains, as well as supporting scholarships for their students to train in vocational schools around the country, as well as some of them were sent to even Taiwan. One of the prominent doctors in the Solomons, who is now the Minister of Health, was initially supported by the oil palm company scholarship because he was part of he was a landowner. He is now the Minister of Health in the Solomons. So, there you go. Yeah.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we are out of time, but we do have afternoon tea, so let's continue the discussions informally over afternoon tea. Please thank the panel for their presentations today.